So I guess start at the beginning is probably the best place. So yeah, those of you that don't know my story, my son was diagnosed with leukemia aged 10, and that was in 2010. 2 years later, he was diagnosed with a secondary cancer. Tumours arrived in his throat. And the cancer that he had then was so rare that there was only 5 people in the world who actually had it at the time, but he was the only one to have it as a secondary cancer, which made him the boy in 7 billion. And so the journey that he took me on, I started to blog about him and I started to write about him because he was so incredibly rare, in the hope that people, if other people had this cancer, they would find us and we could share notes and, hopefully find an answer for it. But what happened was the only treatment they could decide was a bone marrow transplant, and he ended up having 4 in 10 months. They told us that nobody's ever engrafted with a bone marrow transplant after 50 days. And at day 46, Deryn had 3 catastrophic infections, 2 in his hand, 1 in his mouth. And they told us that the only thing keeping him alive was his antibiotics. That was it. So we were asked to take him to a hospice. He was now 14, and he was given 3 days to live. They told us that once we stopped the antibiotics, the infections would take him. But it didn't. And we moved to the hospice, and he carried on, and he held on. And it got to around about day 70, and he was starting to get very, very anxious. And I'd asked for another bone marrow aspirate to be done to absolutely prove to me there was nothing there in his bone marrow, because I couldn't understand how he was still alive. But his organs had started to shut down, and we were told this was the beginning of the end. And it was around about day 70 that we'd had the results that there was absolutely nothing in his bone marrow, and this was now just the time we had to wait. And Deryn became very anxious because obviously he'd been told he was going to die, but it seemed to be taking forever. And at one point, he even begged me to take him to Belgium because they just legalised euthanasia for children over 12. And I told him, no, it rains in Belgium, you don't want to go there. So we kind of stayed here with him, and they were trying to up the morphine and add sleeping tablets and basically sedate him. Now, Deryn had been very open and honest in his death plan and had said that he didn't want to die off morphine because he wanted to experience his death. He told me they weren't going to take that from him. They'd already taken everything else, and he wanted to experience that part of the end of his life. So when I saw him comatose most of the time on morphine, obviously I asked them to take it away, but they couldn't because he would become very anxious. So I looked at what the hospice workers had nicknamed the magic under the bed, which they nicknamed afterwards. We had a jar so big. A friend of mine had given me some cannabis and said, this might work. And we didn't really think anything of it. We made a tincture to put in a vape pen, but it wasn't strong enough. So we just had this jar of stuff under the bed, and we didn't really do anything with it. And I just thought, maybe what if I give him loads? Cannabis is supposed to chill people out. If I give him loads. So I did. And that evening, he refused his morphine. He didn't need it. He refused another drug called cyclazine, which he'd been incredibly addicted to. And he slept and he was chilled out. And for the following 5 days, it was beautiful. The only drugs he had was this tincture I was giving him. And it was going to give me the death that he wanted. And it was going to give him the death that he so deserved to have, which was peaceful and nice and calm and not off your face on morphine or screaming in agony. And so we were happy. For me, this was a miracle already. He was going to die how he wanted to die. And that would made me so happy already. What happened 5 days later when the bandages came off his hand, where his hand was incredibly infected. I mean, there was necrotic. There's pictures on the internet. If you squeamish, don't look. That he'd gone. The bandage came off and his hand had healed. And the doctors couldn't understand it, couldn't believe it. So they did a blood test. And I said, you told me 5 days ago there's nothing there. And lo and behold, there was his count, and it had come from nowhere. And the doctors ran around frantically, ripped up the do not resuscitate forms that we'd had to sign, and said, "You're no longer dying. What do you want us to do if you now spike a temperature?" And he said, "You can leave me the fuck alone." and since that day, he hasn't had one pharmaceutical drug since he left the hospice. He continued to use cannabis for a while, and I watched his count double and double and double as I gave it. And I didn't want anybody to be able to tell me this was a coincidence, because I knew already it wasn't, but I had to have proof. And I knew I only had this one opportunity. So I took the cannabis away, and his immune system halved. So I gave it back, and it doubled. And I did that over a 6-week period to watch for myself. So I knew for a fact that this is what had a profound effect on him. Fast forward another 6 months, and I withdrew the cannabis because I thought, well, he's better now. I don't need to keep giving it to him. And I'd got involved with the Bristol Cannabis Club. And they kept telling me, you need to meet Jeff Ditchfield. You need to see Jeff Ditchfield. And this name was alluding around everywhere. And Deryn had been attempting to kill himself for the following 6 months through starvation. He got down to about 26 kilos because he'd accepted he was going to die. And as a 14-year-old, they'd accepted he was going to die. He planned his funeral. He planned everything, the music, everything, the fancy dress costumes we were all going to have to wear. He had planned everything. And to have that taken away from him, he said it's like, he described it as if you can see everything you've ever wanted through a door and it's beautiful and you know it's going to be the end of all the pain and everything, and then you get so close and someone slams it in your face and tells you not now, and he couldn't cope. So he tried to starve himself and he tried to kill himself a number of times. They wanted to section him, sedate him and force feed him rather than talk to him. They said he didn't qualify for any mental health help. So I pleaded with them and I said, let me take him to Spain. I want to go to Spain with him. If I come back and he's still not well, then I'm going to have to sign him. I knew I'd have to anyway, because they make your children a ward of the court if you don't do what they want you to do. So I knew I only had this one opportunity. And so I took him to Spain, and that's where I met Jeff. And that day, Jeff gave us a tiny little syringe and said, just give him a very small amount the following morning, to which we did. And within half an hour, my husband and I at the time were preparing some lunch, and I shouted down to the kids, do you want anything to eat? Half expecting this kind of no, which I'd had for the last 6 months. And to which Deryn shouted up, make me loads, I'm starving. And, that right in the feels. And so we did. We made him loads of food, and he didn't stop eating for 12 hours that day. I had to go down to the supermarket 3 times. He didn't stop eating, and same again for the next day and the next day and the next day. And 12 days later, I took him back to hospital, and he put on 4 kilos, and he didn't want to die anymore. And the doctor said, wow, that holiday did him the world of good. I said, yes, it was the holiday. There was no way in the world I could tell them at the time what I'd done, because there's the threat of social services. There's that real threat of social services and the real threat of social services for me isn't that my children would go into care, because they're pretty robust kids and I think they'd probably be all right. My concern would be that Deryn would lose the only medicine that had worked for him and the only reason why he was still alive, and that would be a death sentence to him. And so that was my concern, and that's why I kept quiet until he was almost 18 and my book came out back in April, when I felt that he was safe enough to not be taken by social services. But even though I was quiet for those sort of 2 years, I was still helping people in the background. People would come to me and say, I need the same miracle you got. So everybody that came to me, I would tell them exactly what I did, risking being outed by any one of those people contact me. Could have been undercover or anything, but I couldn't take that risk. I couldn't hold that information to myself when people were so desperate for it. So I've been working alongside Bud Buddies for a number of years now, and helping children and helping the parents of them. And when I recently went down to Parliament, I didn't intend to get arrested when I went down to Parliament. That wasn't my intention. I'm blaming Jeff for all of that. But as I said when I was a loose women, I would do every day of a 14-year sentence if it meant that my son's still alive, and the people that I've helped so far, the parents of the children are still going through this. They can't stand up and talk like I can. I have to be their voice. I've been asked by so many of them to talk on their behalf because they can't. They're still treating their children. Their children are still very young. There's a real risk to every single one of them. They're going to lose their children. So this is why I do what I do, because I feel I didn't choose this. It chose me, that guy, and I can't walk away from it. But yeah, I'll go on to kind of how I discovered the food and how food has an incredible impact on your body when you have cancer, or even before you have cancer. When you're initially diagnosed with cancer, you'll be told to eat as much crap as you want because it's going to fatten you up, because the chemo is going to make you lose weight. That's probably one of the worst things you can do, especially with the processed foods they encourage you to eat. Meat, sugar and dairy are the 3 things that feed cancer the most, sugar being the most prevalent. And I only found this out because after Deryn's second cancer turned up in his tonsils, he'd had the tonsils removed, but there was some lesions in the back and they weren't sure whether they were cancerous or not. So they had to take the rest of they took about a third of his soft palate and a lot of his throat out, and they had to test it all. Now they gave him a PET scan beforehand. Now, I didn't know what a PET scan was. I sat there and the woman brought through this big syringe of what looked like tar to me. And I said, what's that? And she said, it's irradiated glucose.
I said, all right, well, why? And she said, because she said, sugar feeds cancer quicker than anything else. She said, without sugar, cancer cannot survive. I went, what is just like normal sugar? She went, yeah, glucose. I went, okay. I didn't really think any more of it. I was, watching this horrible, nasty stuff go into him. And she gave me a Geiger counter, actually. She said, if it starts going up, move away from him. And I thought, what the hell is that doing inside his veins then? You know what I mean? But you can't say no. You can't say no to any of this. So I moved away from him because it went up. And I thought no more of it until I went home that evening. Now, go back a little while. Deryn had pancreatitis because of the treatment. And he'd lost 2.5 stone. And he couldn't cope with any of the dairy supplements they give you. So they gave him another supplement called Maxigel. And she gave me a 5-kilo tub of this stuff. She said, put it in everything. So I did. Put it in everything. And 6 months later, his tumours turned up. I looked at that tub when I got home, which was now empty, 100% glucose. And I thought to myself, that's when the light bulb went off for me then. And I thought, why does a dietitian give children on oncology wards 100% glucose when a radiologist knows that glucose feeds cancer quicker than anything else? What's going on here? This is something very, very wrong. And I then started to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And I noticed that the dietitians, their funding for their education comes from the meat, sugar and dairy industries. They are biased. They are so biased. But the thing is, the dietitians, I don't blame the dietitians. I don't blame the doctors. They don't know any better. The doctors and the dietitians and nurses only know what they're told. Who's telling them? Why are they telling them that? Okay, I'm not going to start talking about conspiracies, but when you've been on the cancer money train, like I have been for such a long time, you can't help but start seeing that why are dietitians giving dairy supplements to cancer patients when dairy feeds cancer? There's an IGF-1 hormone in there that actively feeds cancer. Why are they giving it to people? Sugar, meat, everything in the hospital. The food is horrendous. Anyone that's been in hospital, the food is absolutely horrendous. So I urge people, and the reason why I wrote my book really more than anything, it's not for money. I know I've been accused of doing it for money recently. I get 11p a book. Let me just put that out there. I didn't do it for the money. I did it so that I wanted more and more people to understand that you can help yourself and that you can prevent even being a statistic of a cancer. You don't have to go down that road. Please start looking after yourself. Prevention is far better than cure. And I tell you now, I wouldn't wish cancer on anybody. It's horrible. It's horrible. And, I think we're being lied to, obviously, and it's very difficult to counteract that. But if we can prevent even having to go into that, I think meat, sugar and dairy, if you can cut it out of your diets. I advocate, I haven't had sugar for, I can't even remember how long now. Deryn hasn't had sugar. He's training to be a vegan chef and he's fucking good at it, which is good because I hate cooking, so I get him to cook for me. But, just a few dietary changes. And what we have discovered as well, that anybody, if you do get cancer and you're going to use oil, give it the best shot it can. Don't be eating crap as well and trying just to take oil, because you've got to give it a chance. You've got to do something. You can't just rely on oil. Like you wouldn't just rely, or you shouldn't just rely on chemo. We've noticed that people that we help, the ones who are still here to tell the tales, are the ones that change their lifestyles as well. It bought the others time, but they're not still here, most of them, So if there is anything wrong with you and you are taking oil, please look at your diets as well. We're lied to about our food. You've really got to start taking care of yourself. I don't want to hear from any of you saying that you need my help. I don't want that. Okay, I want prevention and I want education and I want people to understand that you can help yourselves. And that's why I wrote my book. And also to prove to people, to show people that cannabis is a medicine and it's not something to be, to be scared of or to be lied about, and we can't keep lying about it. And again, normality, you just talk about it like it's normal. I smoke out in the street. If anyone catches me, they catch me. I pretend it's normal because it is. If you don't believe you're doing anything wrong, if you act like you're doing something wrong, then, so just pretend you're not, you're not doing anything wrong.